afternoon, everyone. Thanks for returning. This is the panel, Lawfare, the Criminalization of Politics. My name is Ellen Fantini. I'm the managing editor of the European Conservative. That's a quarterly magazine and online news, commentary, and analysis website. So in my capacity as managing editor, among other things, I run the daily news and current affairs side of our publication. I work to help explain the rule of law battles in Europe and the use of lawfare against sovereign countries to achieve political outcomes. But in my previous life, before I moved to Europe, I was a criminal prosecutor here in the United States. It was a profession I was very proud of, partly because of the lessons I learned from my first boss. When I was just starting out as a baby prosecutor, my mentor and boss emphasized the profound responsibility that rests on the state's shoulders in a criminal trial. He told me I should always zealously advocate for our client, that would be the state, the government, but to never cut corners, to keep my hands scrupulously clean, and to always remember that our significant power requires the very highest level of moral and ethical responsibility, because simply being charged with a crime, not to mention convicted of it, could harm a person's life and reputation forever. He said if we win a case, that is, convict a person of a crime, justice has prevailed. But if we lose a case, that is, a person is found not guilty of a crime, justice has also prevailed, because we cannot believe in a justice system when we only when we like the outcome. But today, here in America, it is harder and harder to believe in the justice system. The power of the state has been weaponized by rogue prosecutors. The law itself has been turned into a weapon against wrong thinkers and the government's political opponents. Those political opponents have been rounded up and systematically charged with crimes, including ones invented for such an occasion. And here in America, the government's political opponents are being stripped of their livelihoods and imprisoned, while, as Rachel Bogard said this morning, the government's criminal allies run free. I'm delighted to introduce my esteemed panel to discuss these issues and to discuss how we can fight back. So I'm joined on the stage by John Yu. He's the Emanuel Heller Professor of Law at the University of California at Berkeley. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Next to John Yu is Mike Howell. He's the executive director of the Heritage Oversight Project. And next to Mike is John Eastman. He's the founding director of the Claremont Institute's Center for Constitutional Jurisprudence, and until 2021, served as the Henry Salvatori Professor of Law and Community Service at Chapman University's Dale E. Fowler School of Law. He's also a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute. And next to John Eastman is Will Chamberlain. He's senior counsel at the Internet Accountability Project and was previously the publisher of Human Events. So each of our speakers will be given about 12 minutes for opening remarks, and then we'll have a discussion, including questions from the audience. Once we open it to the audience, feel free to line up for questions, and we'll have a lively debate, I hope. So, the floor is yours, John.
Thank you very much. You hear me in the back? Yeah. That's great. It's a pleasure to leave the People's Republic of Berkeley and go to far more conservative places like Washington, D.C. I've been teaching at Berkeley now. This is my 30th year. Please don't hold it against me. And I gotta say, it's great to be back here at MagCon. I feel like I played the loyal opposition the last time I was here. I think it was 2 years ago on a panel about common good constitutionalism. I'm not sure if I'm NatCon, but I do believe in nationalism. I do think the nation state has been a great force for good in the last 100 years. And I do think of myself as a conservative. I'm here to learn whether putting the two together is superior to the sum of the parts. It's also great to be here with a distinguished panel. And I want to just say, especially with John Eastman, I testify. To my mind, unfortunately, John has become a symbol of what the very excesses of what we're going to talk about today produce. And I testified on his behalf before the California bar. And one thing I thought at the time when I said was, it's a good thing that the southern states did not know about lawfare before Brown versus Board of Education, because otherwise Thurgood Marshall would have been disbarred in every southern state for pressing arguments which were directly contrary to 60 years of precedent and laws and systems of every southern state in the country at that time. Whereas that John was arguing in a context, not just was it time pressure and politically heated, but an area where there were no precedents. There were no judicial precedents, almost no statutes, and a lot of uncertainty about what the law said. And so I thought it was particularly inappropriate to try to sanction him through the bar or, since then, the criminal justice system. And so I just wanted to recognize the fact that John has been quite courageous, I think, in standing up to this unbelievable campaign of lawfare that's been waged against him. Since we wanted to have time for questions from the audience, I tried to give some very abbreviated remarks, and I already wasted half of it saying good things about John Eastman. And usually, saying good things about John Eastman takes only 10 seconds, not 5 minutes. So I think we could define lawfare as Ellen did. Another way I like to think of lawfare is by using Clausewitz's definition of warfare. Right? Lawfare comes from the idea of law and warfare. You may know the origins of the phrase is from a friend of mine, Charlie Dunlop, who was writing about, in fact, the ways after 9/11 terrorist groups used our own legal system to try to continue their war against the United States. Clausewitz said war is the continuation of politics by other means. And I think that's what we're living through now, that we're seeing the use of prosecution as just a continuation of politics by other means. And the point of my remarks is, unfortunately, I think you have to approach it and think about warfare. And we have a side, I don't think it's, unfortunately, particularly Democrat or Republican, I think it's more progressives versus conservatives, but progressives who believe in bringing about a utopian world, who are willing to do anything to achieve that means, to cast aside institutions and cast aside norms. They have broken an important tradition and norm in our country of not prosecuting past presidents, not prosecuting the leading opposition candidate for president. And that, unfortunately, if we look at warfare, the only way to get someone who refuses to obey an important norm is that you have to retaliate. You have to retaliate against them exactly the same way until you restore some amount of deterrence. And so if we're not going to become a banana republic country where we continuously prosecute our predecessors in office, unfortunately, I'm afraid we're going to have to use banana republic means, which is, I think, unfortunately, people who have used this tool against people like John or President Trump have to be prosecuted too by Republican or conservative DAs in exactly the same way for exactly the same kinds of things until they stop. And we can restore the norm which existed for the first 230 years of our republic through times when politics were just as heated as our own, or maybe even more so. But we never crossed this Rubicon of using prosecution to achieve our political ends. And during the question and answer, I'm happy to talk about any of the Trump trials and how what's going on in them. But the reason why I say what I do is because the charges in these cases were so flimsy. I'm willing to entertain if the special counsel here in Washington had charged Donald Trump with insurrection and sedition, which are crimes in the federal code, I might think differently about it. And if he could prove it. Instead, he went to a grand jury in Washington, D.C., of all places, and can only get them to indict President Trump for fraud of the kind that we usually charge hospital systems with or defense contractors for. Fraud where you steal money from the government. They charged him with obstruction on a charge that was just thrown out by the Supreme Court for being misused against anyone involved with January 6th. And for depriving everyone in the country simultaneously of their voting rights. I don't know if you felt that happen to you in November of 2020, but Donald Trump took away all your voting rights simultaneously by trying to get Mike Pence to reject electoral votes from certain states. To me, the fact that the charges were so weak, that the facts so loosely connected to those charges, is what led me to think the prosecutions are partisan in nature. And that's why the natural response has to be to stop them. You have to do prosecutions too. One other quick point about this is one other lesson we've learned about these prosecutions is we all expect, I think, as Americans, that the courts will do something about it. And I hope one lesson we've learned from the Trump trials is that the rule of law, if you want to say the rule of law is the requirement that the same cases are treated in the same way, it's not really up to the courts anymore. It's up to the administrative state and the executive branch. The government, the executive branch, and prosecutors have so much power to destroy someone's livelihood and their reputation before ever stepping foot in court. That they're really the ones who control whether we have the rule of law. If they prosecute someone like John Eastman, they could destroy his finances and his reputation before any judge ever sees him. The judges also say they're not going to review under this doctrine of prosecutorial discretion why prosecutors pick out someone or someone else for prosecution. So when Donald Trump is prosecuted for hoarding classified documents, courts will not say, but why didn't the Justice Department charge Hillary Clinton for routing thousands of classified emails through her, right? I don't know. I would call it a non-secure home computing system. Right? That's, unfortunately, courts will not guarantee the rule of law by looking at the reasons why prosecutors choose cases. And so the only restraint on prosecutors, the only way to guarantee equal treatment, the rule of law, is by prosecutors limiting themselves. And how do you do that? You can only do it through elections, by electing people who will demand that the subordinates in the executive branch follow what you would think of would be basic principles, like equal treatment under the law. Or the tactic I'm suggesting, unfortunately, which is now, if one side is in charge of the executive branch and they're not willing to follow these principles, then I think red state DAs should charge some leading Democratic politicians with fraud, with obstruction, with RICO charges, like the DA in Georgia, in Fulton County, has charged the Fulton County DA has actually charged a political campaign as being a racketeering, which is the phrase we use for organized crime enterprise. Well, unfortunately, I think the only way to deter that from continuing is for red state DA to charge some Democratic campaign with. And that's let me close quickly in the interest of time. I'm afraid that's how I would think of lawfare. With lawfare, we tend to focus on the law. I'm calling for us to think about it also as a form of warfare. And so when you think about warfare, the only way that you can encourage good behavior, a return to norms, is through deterrence. And the only way to restore deterrence now that one side has crossed this constitutional Rubicon is that unfortunately you have to be as tough on them as they have been on you. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you.
Heritage Foundation's oversight project. Concur with everything Professor Yu just said, and I think it's a terrific point from where I can pick up from. He basically explained what the situation is, what Lawfare is. A brief moment here to describe the why. Everyone always asks, why is this happening? Why is this getting worse? And the answer to me couldn't be any more obvious. For the same reason a bully will take the lunch money of a kid day after day, is the same reason why the left is escalating their lawfare tactics to areas once unthinkable. I mean, they're literally trying to put President Trump in bars for the rest of his life and to rig an election that way. And the reason they've been able to progress over the last decade or so to map out the trajectory of increasingly antagonistic lawfare-type actions is because there is no resistance. And so I absolutely agree there needs to be a fight back and believe that's what we're doing at the Oversight Project. We've sued Biden over 100 times, have produced record sets that have destroyed key narratives, but that's not enough. So we need to survey kind of the troops if we're really going to speak in terms of warfare and getting to an actual place to fight back. So there's 3 categories of troops I will say right now which are wholly insufficient. The first is the United States Congress, and in particular the current U.S. House of Representatives and its majority. Now, what was supposed to be a red wave election to provide a check on the Biden administration and its most flagrant excesses has turned into the exact opposite. I don't think anyone can disagree that the weaponization of the Biden administration and others has gotten worse since the majority flipped to Republicans this Congress. And why is that? It's because now there is just a token veneer of opposition to give this kind of attack some legitimacy. And it's because we do not demand nearly enough of our elected leaders to actually get results. We have been stuck in a cycle of applauding the announcement process. What I mean by that is we praise people for sending letters. We praise them for holding hearings where they don't even develop a record or ask any hard questions. They're uncoordinated messes intended only to generate Twitter clips, and only for the sole political purpose of associating a politician with a conflict that the people care about. They've completely given up any means to actually use their power to put an end to this. Now, there are limits to what Congress can do, but the most obvious one is stop funding this stuff. At every step of the way, this House majority decided to fund, in particular, all of these prosecutions, which have connective tissue, back to federal funds going out one way or the other. They've continued the border crisis. They've given President Biden every last legislative accomplishment he's wanted. It's not far-fetched when they say he has the best legislative record since Lyndon B. Johnson. Of course, I think the legislative record's awful, but its body of work in terms of its history and magnitude certainly compares to that, and it was gifted to him by a House Republican majority. And so we can never even pretend to begin to fight back until we start demanding those people who invest with power the actual results and demand the results that we need. What this looks like in pure practice is an avalanche of subpoenas that are enforced. Not just the sending of subpoena over letter, but actually enforced. People in front of depositions every single day, and not just this limited kind of shot and window that politicians like to take, where it's a cabinet secretary in a hearing or somebody else behind closed doors. I'm talking about thousands at a scale that far exceeds what the January 6th committee was able to pull off. Now, really quick on that, because I think this really proves the point that Congress is completely ineffective. For Speaker McCarthy to become Speaker, he had to make a series of concessions. One of those concessions was the establishment of a weaponization committee, which was sold as, at the time, as a parallel to the 1970s mega church committee. And it would be endowed with the full funding sources that the January 6th committee had, about $20 million. They haven't touched that money, but for a few $1 million. We're going to end this Congress with money either returning back to the Biden administration that was supposed to be spent investigating it, or some other means of getting rid of it inside the legislative branch. Literally, resources in this fight are being left on the table. Next step in the war, and a big problem I think we need to confront, the conservative legalism. We're in this disaster in large part due to them and our continued reliance on them. The best example I've ever encountered on this is, post-January 6th. A lot of friends of mine who did nothing wrong that day but happened to be a staffer for the wrong White House were faced with, tens and thousands of dollars of legal bills just to comply with the congressional subpoena. What was the conservative legal movement's reaction to that? Profit maximization. To charge these young and up-and-coming staffers with debt that'll saddle them for the rest of their careers. The same thing plays out in all the other kind of lawfare exercises. Our lawyers, the ones that we'll nominate for, to be USAs or judges one day, we allow them to rape us financially in these situations. And a movement cannot survive much longer if criminal defense and defense in this area is that prohibitively expensive. And so we need to disrupt this market that is feeding off our biggest problems. And I think when we talk about new institutions and what needs to be built to actually deal with this moment, we need to fundamentally reconsider the role that the conservative legal establishment plays in it. It's time for them to get on the team and in these fights and not just get rich off them, because that's what I see happening across the board. It's why legal defense funds are so important right now, but they need not be, because we do have the capacity and the organizational potential to solve that problem. And finally, I'll say, absolutely right on the state AGs. Why we haven't seen any action coming out of state AGs, I think there's been some good nods and steps in that movement, is the same reason we don't see actions out of Congress. We basically are too cheap of dates as a base. We need to demand actual results. And if you look at the chargeable potential activity, it's all out there. I mean, the Biden family business spans multiple jurisdictions that are red right now. Virginia, Louisiana, they instantly come to mind. The legal theories that can be proffered and utilized, there is no shortage of. And so I guess in closing, would encourage everybody to hold our elected leadership to a much, much higher standard. Because I think we're eventually just going to slowly boil over and die out if there is not a fight back. And right now we have a bunch of people who are telling everyone in this room that they are fighting back, but they're leaving every tool on the table, and that's not all right. So I'll end there.
Thanks for having me. I get a call from the President of the United States in late November 2020 asking whether I would represent him in the Supreme Court. That's a call. The only answer to a question like that is, of course. Funny thing happened on the way to the forum, though. Huh? So I'm unindicted co-conspirator number 2 in D.C., indicted co-conspirator number 3 in Georgia, and indicted co-conspirator number 13 in Arizona. I dropped down in my ranking there. What's going on? I gave advice about, based on, John, you pointed out earlier, based on open questions of constitutional law. In areas that I'm one of, I think, probably a dozen or fewer experts in the country. Nevertheless, the lawyers in the California bar decided they knew more about the Constitution than all of the scholars that had been writing this, and said I had no basis for it. They were so brilliant on their constitutional analysis that they served a subpoena on the Supreme Court of the United States to get a copy of the brief I filed. The clerk of the court wrote back and said, maybe you don't understand basic notions of federalism and supremacy clause, but we're not subject to the jurisdiction of the California Bar Court. And oh, by the way, the brief you're seeking is publicly available on our website. One of the charges against me for making misrepresentations and therefore exhibiting moral turpitude, that was the phrase they used over and over again in the 100-some page indictment against me in California, was that I had falsely claimed that dead people voted in my few minutes of remarks on the mall in front of the ellipse. And that was false, and I knew it was false because by then the Inspector General of Michigan had already determined that only 1,500 dead people voted in Michigan. And I said, so you just admitted my statement was true. Yeah, but what you really meant by that was more dead people voted and would have affected the outcome. This is the distortion of everything that's going on. The RICO charge in Georgia, the use of the mob witness intimidation statute in D.C., and I use that phrase deliberately The statute was originally the mob witness intimidation statute. If I've got some witness that's going to turn state's evidence against the mob, and I threaten to kill him or his family, I add 20 years to the mob sentence you'd otherwise get. After Enron, we added another clause that says, or if you destroy all your financial records and in order to avoid prosecution, we're going to keep that 20-year felony sentence against you for that, or otherwise obstruct an official proceeding. That's the clause that they use against J6. That's 2 of the 4 counts against President Trump in D.C. that the Supreme Court finally threw out just last month, a couple weeks ago. The mob witness intimidation statute, the mob RICO statute down in Georgia, or the conspiracy charges down in Arizona. This weaponization is designed not just to go after the people that took political and constitutional positions contrary to the established state in our country, but to send a message to everybody else that if you dare stand up against us, we will bring all the force of government on you as well. That's the significance of what's going on. Hey, whether they take my bar license in California, I just assume they're not, but it's not the big end of the world. My wife and I are close to retirement. We don't need that. It would be nice to be able to continue to engage in the fight. But the bigger threat is David Brock, who's one of the powers behind the 65 Project. They brought over 100 bar complaints against all the lawyers that were involved in any of the litigation, election litigation. And he said, our goal is not just to get them disbarred, but to make them so toxic in their firms and their communities that right-wing legal talent will never stand up for these kind of election challenges again. Think about what that means. If they're going to steal the next election and the one after that and the one after that as far as the eye can see, they will only be able to do it if they first killed all the lawyers, or at least scared us into ever standing up against the illegality that was blatant in that last election. That's what the ultimate mission is. And thank you, Liz Cheney. You made me probably the most famous lawyer in the world, and this is why they're coming after me, because I won't back down to it. And that's the key. The only way you push back against this stuff is to not back down to it. So when the California bar has a rule, state law, they're not allowed to disclose that there's an investigation going on unless they determine that the disclosure is necessary to protect the public. So the night before a major brief was due by the January 6th committee in privilege log litigation that I was having with them, they turned it into a massive cost of $300,000 for privilege log litigation. The night before they had a major brief due, the head of the bar announced that they were doing an investigation of me, and then that's quoted in the brief, because I'm a threat to the public. When they recommended that I be disbarred and impose a stay, they didn't accept our request to stay that judgment pending the appeal because I'm a threat to the public. Now think about what that means. I'm a threat to the public because I won't shut up about what went on in the 2020 election. And I keep shining a light. And you know what? I've got the receipts. And they can't stand it. We have now moved from banana republic to Soviet-style tactics. Yerventi Berea, show me the man and I'll show you the crime. The exact opposite of Robert Jackson's pledge or plea to all the U.S. attorneys when he first became Attorney General under Franklin Roosevelt. He had a meeting of all the U.S. attorneys. So the biggest danger you're going to confront is the temptation to use the awesome prosecutorial power, not to go after crimes and figure out who done it, but to find people you don't like and scour the books to find some crime that you can pin them on. One of my legal team is Harvey Silverglade. He's the author 15, 20 years ago now of 3 felonies a day. He says every one of us commits 3 felonies a day, particularly with the elastic interpretation that these places are offering to it. So if they don't like you, they're not going to go after you for your speech. They're going to go after you for some anti-mob witness intimidation statute or some RICO provision. This is insane. And it will destroy the thing that has made us singularly the most successful regime in human history. And that is the rule of law. And that's what they're throwing out in their undivided effort to get Trump, to prevent Trump. By the way, everybody knows They keep saying to protect our democracy. How do you protect our democracy by trying to keep the leading candidates off the ballot? It's like the antithesis of it. All right. Yeah, thank you. So, people say, well, why didn't you just give up the California bar license and get the license someplace else? They said I had no evidence. And none of the 65 courts, there was actually more than 100 court decisions, none of them ever looked at the evidence. They were mostly kicked out on various technical grounds, some correct. Ordinary citizens, surprisingly, don't have standing to challenge an illegal election, but the campaigns do. They were not given the opportunity to challenge those elections anyway. Some cases were brought before the election challenging illegal guidance by the secretaries of state, and the court said, it's only a guidance until they actually violate the law. The case is not right. Then they violated the law on election day, and they bring the same suit over again. And the court says, you can't wait till your guy loses to bring the case. It's like doctrine of latches. So it was damned if you do, damned if you don't. This was what went past for litigation and challenging that. So when they said I have no evidence in this bar complaint, I said I got lots of evidence. I got probably more evidence than almost anybody else in the country. Because when I filed that brief on behalf of the president in the Supreme Court, I had to put my email address on it. You want to see a flood of emails coming? Try that. Everywhere, anywhere in the world, anybody had something to say about what went on in the election. It came into me. And so I said, all right, they say I have no evidence. We're going to spend $750,000 putting on the evidence. We're going to put on the evidence. We're going to put on the experts. What I was allowed to put on was unbelievable. And I'll show you how unbelievable it was. The judge didn't bother to cite any of it in her opinion that says I had no evidence. My favorite one of these, well, I told you the story of the dead people voting. But $750,000 to build the record that might be useful elsewhere. That's what you call pushback. People say, well, what do you think is going to happen in the future? Will they steal it again? Probably. There are millions of eyes watching this time, though, that weren't watching last time, as a result of efforts like mine and other similar efforts to expose what's going on. It's critically important. And then people say, well, what about the next generation? Aren't they lost, all these kids being indoctrinated? I'll tell you a little story. One of the kids I'm representing right now, virtually secondhand, because my bar license is suspended at the moment, but his name is Jaden Rodriguez. Jaden, you probably don't know the name, but you know his story because it went viral. He's the kid with the Gadsden flag patch on his backpack that got suspended from school. And he stood up to it. When his assistant principal and his teacher said, you can't wear that patch because it's a symbol of slavery, he said, no ma'am, it's not. It's a symbol of standing up against government tyranny. That's the kind of kid that is going to be leading the next generation. And a lot of people at this conference are like that kid, and that gives me hope and optimism. Let me close with this story. We run our summer fellowship programs at the Claremont Institute. Lincoln, Publius, Marshall. I mostly teach in the Marshall Fellowship Program. Last summer's program was the week that the Georgia indictment handed down. And so at the end of the week we give them a nice dinner, good wine, and roast each other and toast each other. And usually, they normally give a little nod to the faculty, thank you very much, and the next toast. Well, I was dieted in the middle of the thing. I got to do something a little more than that. So they roast me. They say, I'm teaching a religion clause seminar with Janice Rogers Brown and Phil Munoz. When news of that came down and all the phones were ringing. And so the roast was, he continues to teach the religion clauses and FBI jackbooted folks are rappelling down from the rooftops and come in and arrest them and carry them off. That didn't happen. But they said it was an exhibition of courage that was contagious, that everybody in the room decided to double down in their commitment to defend this country. And then the guy closed with this. He said, if you think about that last line in our national anthem, is the flag still waving? You remember with the line? He said, it's not so much whether the flag still waves. It's what kind of land is it waving over? Is it still the land of the free and the home of the brave? Or is it becoming the land of the coward and the home of the slave? That was profound. And that's why we fight. And any organization in this town or in this country that hasn't recognized we're in a war and is doing what they can to engage in that war doesn't understand or deserve our support. And there are a whole lot of them. They're sitting on the sidelines. And I've told some of them, I said, look guys, keeping your head low so that the alligator eat you last has never been a winning strategy. It's not, never has been, and it's not now. We have to recognize this is a war. We have to engage in this war, and we've got to do it with everything we've got, or we will lose something that we inherited that is more precious than life itself. And by God, I'm not going to sit by and let my kids and my grandkids, and I've got one already and another on the way, have to deal with things because we sat on our butts in silence while they were taking us over. That's why I fight, and I appreciate you all. If there's out at the Claremont Institute a way to read our legal defense fund and keep updated on what we're doing, it's out on the Claremont Institute website. But stay in the fight, get in the fight if you're not already, and get your other organizations in the fight as well, because this is the fight for our time, and it's every bit as important as the fight our grandfathers waged to protect freedom in the world in World War I and World War II, or the fight to get rid of slavery, or the fight that our founders fought to get rid of governmental tyranny that pales in comparison to the tyranny that we're dealing with. Get in the fight, stay in the fight until we win this fight. Thanks very much.
I'm a big fan of that Justice Jackson quotation. It's a wonderful speech too. You should read the whole thing, The Power of the Prosecutor. But anyway, I'll get straight to the point. My thesis echoes a lot of what everybody's been saying. We should use non-frivolous counter lawfare against those who use lawfare against conservatives. And that's across the board. That's brought, elected officials at the state level, hopefully the federal level when President Trump comes. But we should be willing to use this tool against those who used it against conservatives. And I think I was thinking about it this morning. The reasons why actually echo a lot of the justifications for criminal punishment. So if you ever take criminal law, those who've gone to law school, there are 4-ish general justifications for why criminal punishment is used. Right? There's justice, generally, it's just a just thing to punish those who've done wrong. There's deterrence, to deter future criminals from engaging in wrong. There's incapacitation, taking someone who is inclined to engage in criminal activity and imprisoning them so that they can no longer do so. And then there's a softer one that has something to do with honor or meaning, the idea that if you don't prosecute in a serious crime seriously enough, then you are saying something that society isn't valuing the victim's life sufficiently. If you only punish a murderer with 5 years in jail, what you're saying is the victim's life didn't really matter that much. And I think those justifications for criminal punishment actually are very similar to what looks like a very good justification for using lawfare against those who have used lawfare against us. So first, let's talk about justice. And we can do very specific examples to kind of think about why it would be just to use lawfare. Let's just start with Fani Willis, for example. The substance of Fani Willis's allegations, I mean, there's a lot of different ones, they're kind of convoluted. But the substance of some of them is she alleges that John and others lied to Georgia courts about the 2020 election. And she got up on the stand in her hearing to get removed from the case, and she lied about the beginning of her relationship with Nathan Wick, to the point that the judge in that case said there was an odor of mendacity hanging. More than that, it seems that there was a conspiracy to engage in lying, because both she and Wade got their stories straight in order to engage in that lie. I don't even think it's lawfare to see that she's prosecuted. I think it's simply justice. That is appalling. And it's also an incredible shame that the Attorney General of Georgia, Chris Carr, hasn't done a thing on this matter at all. I don't know what he is waiting for, but she lied under oath in front of the entire country, and nothing has happened to her yet. That is a shame, and it needs to be changed. Let's talk about Kristen Clark. Kristen Clark is one of the most aggressive wielders of lawfare in our Department of Justice. She's responsible for the prosecution of the grandmothers who pray in front of abortion clinics. She's responsible for the prosecution of Mr. Ethan Heim, the doctor in Texas, who blew the whistle on the transgender surgeries on children, the mutilation of children that was happening there, and she's prosecuting him for a HIPAA violation. So she's, an aggressive wielder, someone who does just what we think of as lawfare, these norm-breaking, colorable, maybe not frivolous, but barely colorable prosecutions. And she was revealed that she perjured herself when she was nominated for her position. She was asked in writing whether or not she'd ever been arrested or accused of a violent crime. Not whether she'd ever been convicted or whether it had been expunged, but no, merely whether he'd ever been arrested or accused. She said no. In fact, 20 years ago, she had a dispute with her husband where she cut his ring finger to the bone and was arrested for it. She decided that that didn't need to be disclosed to the committee. I'm sorry, you perjured yourself under oath. It is perfectly just, given how aggressively you apply all these other laws, to face a 5-year charge under federal perjury statutes. Next, Juan Merchant, Judge Juan Merchant. This is somehow the one judge in the Manhattan court who gave a $10 donation to Stop Republicans and a $15 donation to Joe Biden's campaign, seems to get every single piece of Trump or Trump-friendly criminal case that there is. He got the case against the Trump organization criminally. He obviously got the Stormy Daniels case, and he has the upcoming case against Stephen Bannon. That seems kind of random. I wonder why that is. Maybe it's because, those donations that he gave, they weren't massive. These were like $10 or $15 donations. They weren't trying to move the election. What it was is he raising his hand being like, you want lawfare? I'm the guy. And he should have obviously recused given that. He also should have recused because his daughter is a political consultant who does tons of work with Democrats. And certainly, if the Democrats were pleased with Judge Merchant's performance, they would be perfectly happy to ensure that his daughter was, wallowing in contracts for her social media consulting. He should have recused. It was obvious he didn't do so, and it would be perfectly just to try and remove the impeachment. Merrick Garland. Merrick Garland has thrown Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro in jail for contempt of Congress, for defying subpoenas from Congress. He also is currently in defiance of a subpoena from Congress in relation to the audio testimony of Joe Biden in front of Robert Kirk. And there's no argument that he has no basis for doing this. Why? Because he already released the transcript of this interview. There's no way to say that if there's a transcript of the interview that the actual audio of the interview itself could then be privileged. It's nonsense. It's obviously ridiculous. I think it would be absolutely justice to see Merrick Garland prosecuted for contempt of Congress and treated in the exact same manner as Steve Bannon. So that's justice. Deterrence. Unilateral disarmament doesn't work. It's true throughout nature. Reciprocal altruism is the way you avoid being abused in any sort of game. When people defect, you can't just keep cooperating. You have to just show a willingness to defect yourself. So I think, and it's just something true. Democrats do not change unless they feel the pain of their own rules. That's something simple. You can go back to the independent counsel debates. The independent counsel statute was wielded aggressively against Republicans, and Democrats thought it was this wonderful beacon of the rule of law. And then the Clinton administration came around, and they were all wallowing in independent counsel investigations and thought, maybe this isn't such a good idea. That's what it takes. They have to feel the pain of their own rules. And in some senses, like you're seeing stories now about Kamala Harris is getting out there and saying things like, Trump is thinking about prosecuting his political opponents. How dare he? Like, I feel like it almost like they're just oblivious. Like they have to realize that it's happening to them that these tools can be used. Incapacitation. Obviously, getting lawfare incapacitates by its nature well before we got to the judge. I think John and everybody has done a really good job describing that. Steve Bannon is in jail. He can't impact the election, but people drowning in legal fees constantly. So we need to be willing to use that tool. People like Norm Eisen, who's constantly getting involved in all the lawfare against President Trump, it would be really nice if he were having to deal with his own lawfare and being investigated for his consistent conspiring to deprive President Trump of his civil rights. And finally, I think meaning and honor, and I think this is something I really want to play off of something that was said about how we need the conservative legal movement to stand by our people. I'm going to go to 50 Cent actually had a good explanation. Somebody asked 50 Cent whether or not President Trump should pardon Roger Stone. 50 Cent said, of course, you got to take care of your people. You can't not take care of your people. And I think conservative intellectuals historically have not done a good job of understanding the importance of things like loyalty as compared to conservative voters. I think that's So I think that this is one of, I think, the reasons conservative intellectuals have often struggled to understand Donald Trump and his appeal. I think Donald Trump implicitly understands the importance of loyalty as a result of doing business for 40 years in New York. He gets why that's so important. And I think that so that's I think a part of it. In a world where we're not willing to defend our people who are the targets of lawfare, why would people want to be on our side in the first place? right? We actually have to be, as a party, willing to have honor. I mean, think about it. What is, the mafia is originally the idea of men of honor. Those are people who are not willing to be disrespected. And I don't say that we should be the mafia, that's not the argument, but rather, but the idea being that as a political party, if we aren't willing to dish anything out, then we can just expect to keep taking it. And also, why would people join us? We'll just start losing a lot. That's all that will happen. So I think that's yet another reason to go ahead and, again, engage in non-frivolous lawfare. And what that ultimately looks like, I mean, hopefully we take back the White House so our Department of Justice can actually do something. Hopefully these people will get prosecuted. I think, as John pointed out, the goal is to get back to a place where we aren't using lawfare against each other, because that is the best outcome. It's not good to be turning back and forth, but the only way to get there is by removing these issues.
Okay, so I was a bit frugal with the speaking time so that we'd have a chance to have a bigger discussion and to invite some questions from the audience. So if you have questions for any of these panelists, please come on up, and if you could let us know who you have a question for, and let's not do well, this is more of a comment followed by a question. I'll be like the Seinfeld character who says, "No soup for you." So, please, go ahead.
My name's ZDRoberts, and whoever really feels inclined to answer this question, do you think lawfare should be used asymmetrically against any sort of democratic opposition, or do you think it should be used more as a tool against people who have used it against conservatives? Thanks.
Okay, so
I can take a first stab at it. Is this on? Can you hear me all right? Yeah. So I'm really glad you used the term symmetrically or asymmetrically, because I think we need to think asymmetrically. The left is very well positioned to be able to deal with law. We have the lawyers, the institutions, and the money. Okay? If we were to go out in our wildest dreams, do all the things we wanted to do, I think the left would defensively be able to bear the cost of that fairly easily. Where we need to, I think, up our game, and this is what we're trying to do in the Oversight Project, is the asymmetrical nature of things, which, as was alluded to in earlier conversations, they don't do this just for the ultimate legal, outcome. They do it for the pain incurred along the way. And there's a lot of ways to incur pain that aren't directly in what I would call the lawfare category. These are things that are more reputational in nature. And so to that end, our team is basically half lawyers who have sued Biden over 100 times, but other half investigators going after people involved in these kinds of schemes for the purposes of not only discrediting them by placing the different operators at similar places to prove this is all coordinated by Biden and whatnot, but also at their kind of nonprofit centers. We've sent undercovers into illegal alien shelters to prove that illegals are being given fraudulent residency documents, being told to vote for Joe Biden, admitting to being registered to vote in illegal. And that's something the left is not well positioned to deal with. They can deal with the legal fight, although we still need to bring it, but they can't deal with the asymmetrical, undercover, investigative, and really subversive and disruptive activities. We need to do all of this, everything at once.
All right, next question.
Hello?
But also speak up.
Hello, my name is Matthew, and as somebody who's younger and interested in potentially being a lawyer one day and maybe taking up the cause I'll describe, would you suggest that you're the most prestigious, highly ranked law school that you're able to go based on GPA and LSAT scores, or would you suggest perhaps going to a still highly ranked but more conservative school such as Notre Dame or Sully or something like that?
Can I start on this one? The former. I'd say go to the best law school you can get into. It's the lefty one. I think I went to, that's basically the path I followed. I found it very, very useful to have to engage with top-level liberal law professors. I think that's a very, very useful experience for a young conservative in the sense of you get to refine your arguments very sharply, especially if you've already formed your decent number of your ideas and are very grounded. I think it'll be very useful. I mean, the real worry is it's flip or something, I guess. But I think, and also the higher ranked law school you go to, it's easier to build a resume and it's lower risk in your first year. So I go to a higher.
John, you.
There are no conservatives. Right, so even the schools you listed, I'm sure there's nowhere near 50% of faculty conservative. So the best thing actually is things like this. Really? I'm not so sure. But anyway, so I think the better thing is, you mentioned the conservative legal movement. I think a lot of the ideas about conservatives and law actually come from meetings like this, through networks of lawyers and speakers, not really through formal legal education. So that's what I would spend your time on.
There's your advice.
Thank you.
Okay, next up.
So my question is, how can we as outspoken activists protect ourselves against lawfare? Is this amounts like moving to a red state, saving up funds, credit lawyers and stuff like that, or is there some other advice you give?
Yeah, so you can't. You got to understand we're in a war, and you're going to be on the front lines of the war if you get engaged as you need to, and they're going to throw everything you got. An old professor of mine once said, if you're not catching incoming flak, you're not over the target. You got to steel yourself to be over the target and catching that incoming flak. What we need more of is our conservative legal movement stepping up, that when you do get the lawfare, they'll step up and help. I mean, you know, how many of the electors down in Georgia got competent representation? They finally all did. But nobody on our side of the political aisle stood up to help. I mean, people, you know, I mean, this is your job and your job, right? I mean, this is, they need to, but you've got to understand, you know, what's more important? Sitting in quiet and having a nice white picket fence and, you know, and watching the country go to hell around me? Or getting in the fight, knowing there's going to be some cost and doing what I can to prepare for the cost?
Okay.
Thank you, Stephen Tapp. I'm a lawyer for the 2025 project. So I'm asking this as a young conservative lawyer just out of law school. There's talk sometimes in our circle like, what if the left in their lawfarers are actually using the kiddie clubs right now? You know, lowest power setting. What if there's a possibility, and I'm asking you if there is, that they could expand this to not just going after the big fish like you guys, but actually do things like have their state bar disbar all conservative lawyers, all FedSoc people simultaneously, like actually go to that level. Is that a realistic possibility in the next few decades, or are we being alarmist?
So I would say that at every step of the way, they have accelerated and increased their activities because there's been zero pushback. And so on a long enough timeline, and that's probably not a very long timeline at all, everyone is going to be subject to these things. The reason why they focus on at first the Eastmans of the world, your January 6th defendants, anything related to Trump, is because they thought those were the cases they could sell the American people under this whole argument of insurrection and January 6th and whatnot. But what was really happening here, particularly in Washington, D.C., is the Constitution was being rewritten right in front of our faces as they handled those J6 trials. That is the precedent that is going to be built on, not for the least sympathetic public ties, but it'll grow out to more and more, sympathetic victims, normal, everyday Americans who just may be associated with something the regime at that moment doesn't like. And so that was the real danger, I feel like, in the conservative legal movement, completely abandoning people at that moment in history. The same types of people who will be knocking on, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in a year or so begging for a judgeship or some sort of confirmation. It's that legal movement and infrastructure and institution we needed to have the last go around before, John and others had to go through all that hell. And so I think that's probably the top project of the conservative movement now, is to build out something to protect our people so they cannot continue to expand. Because I guarantee you, this only gets worse unless we do something.
And it's not speculative. I mean, talk to the doctors that, talked about hydroxychloroquine. I mean, they all lost their licenses and nobody stood up. Talk about the parents that showed up at school complaining about men showing up in their teenage daughter's showers or competing against them on the swim teams. When the FBI goes in and starts treating them as domestic terrorists, nobody stood up to represent those people. I mean, shame on us for letting that happen without pushback in as big a way as we could do it. My people are finally starting to get the message, and it took, the poster child here, it took that and maybe a few others, but this is the only way to put a stop to it. I fully embrace what they've said about that.
Next one.
How you doing? Alex Lee from the group. I completely agree with the children's through Lawfare was active. I think the entire crowd here agrees. My question is more for perhaps Trustee you or Professor Eastman, which is how do we convince the other conservatives who might be failing currently, institutionalists, I'm thinking of Andrew McCarthy or a lot of my friends in Federalist Society, who are scared to go down this path and are not to take the moral high ground? What is the most persuasive argument that we can make to our friends on the right who are perhaps not willing to pursue non-frivolous acts?
I actually count myself maybe as one of those too. Andy's a good friend of mine. I think of myself actually defending the institution because what we had was a very successful institution that ran so well for so long, our legal system. And what occurred to me in all this is the deviation from it cannot be corrected by the courts. Maybe it can be corrected by Congress, although, as you mentioned, Congress doesn't want to do anything on this. So I think, unfortunately, even if you're an institution holder, you have to go down this path. The worst possible outcome would be to allow one side to destroy the institution for purely partisan benefit and the other side to do nothing. So that's the actual worst outcome. That's how I think. But I actually think, particularly for example, John and I had a lot of disagreements about vaccination. We might have disagreements about the vector, whatever, the COVID stuff. But I think lawfare is terrible because it's suppressing the right to have freedom of thought, right, and freedom of discussion, which is one way we're going to learn what's true. And so that's the last thing I would say in terms of arguing we should all be. Where institutionalism, not we should all oppose efforts to suppress freedom of speech and thought. And that's, I think, actually the larger goal behind law is not just getting rid of conservative lawyers, but it's to suppress those freedoms.
Yeah, let me add, look, I mean, the way I think that you convince them is to appeal to their heritage. I'm having a senior moment. Patrick Henry or Thomas Paine, criticize we can't have summer soldiers and sunshine patriots. Right? I mean, the fight that we have going on the right now between those that are out front and getting attacked and those that are sitting on the sidelines waiting for it all to blow over and everything will be fine. It's the same fight I gotta believe they had back in Manhattan when you're looking at British loyalists. Don't cause any, right? We don't even have a country if George Washington and Sam Adams and the rest of them hadn't stood up, right? And if we're going to have a country, every one of them needs to stand up. They cannot be summer soldiers and sunshine patriots, only conservative when there's no cost to pay, right? It's precisely because there's a cost to pay that the necessity to stand up is the most vibrant and real. And if they're not willing to do it, get out of the way and let other people who are willing to do it take the lead.
I also think, call them appeasers, right? In the logic of foreign policy, they would understand the flaw in their reasoning immediately, right? Like, oh, our opponents are defecting, they're invading a foreign country. Well, we should take the high ground and not do anything about it, right? Like, the logic that is, I'm sure these people think that way about Ukraine, so just make them invert it and think about it domestically. And realize, like, if you are domestic appeasers, you are appeasing our domestic adversary rather than the establishment.
We start calling instead of rhinos, devils.
Really quick, I know I've been hammering this. We also need to stop rewarding this with things. Like, for instance, Gibson Dunn, a firm that is regarded as many as being on the right. They're representing Alvin Bragg right now in the lawsuit against the House Judiciary. And so it's just like, these are the same types of firms we allow to come back into play in certain circles who are on the other side of the table any other day. So we got to flip that. The litmus test of 2024 shouldn't be policy issues, and we think the tax rate, or whether you think a 0-week apportionment or 6 week. Those are all secondary in my mind to the litmus test that should be, are you willing to fight or not? And that's what I think we need to judge our leaders on. And once you start sorting people that way, we get to building the institution.
Hello, Adam Stansel, Head of Public Relations at AfriForum. I wanted to ask, in the context of an Afrikaner from South Africa, what is the most practical tactical response to an increasingly ideologically captured judicial system. Not the, in theory, based strategy, the real practical brass tacks where the fire hits the road. How do you counter it?
I've been giving a lot of thought to that lately. There are two things underway. Arizona in 2022 added criminal prosecutions to its anti-SLAPP statute. First state in the country to do that. And we've now filed a motion, an anti-SLAPP motion, claiming that this criminal prosecution violates First Amendment rights. And we're going to see what the courts do with it. And, you know, Arizona has a fairly good law-abiding appellate and Supreme Court. And hopefully they will kind of set the marker that other courts, like Michigan, will, oh, maybe we should have been more judicious in our opinions. But the second thing is the California Bar is unbelievably biased in its appointment process. And we need to shine lights on that inherent bias in the courts. These people are not acting judicially. I mean, when a justice on the Michigan Supreme Court, one of the election challenges, can say, I'm not listening to anything you're saying because you just want to keep your king in power. I mean, that should be a disqualifying statement from the bench, and nobody took action against it. We got to start impeaching these judges for acting in such an unbelievably partisan way from the bench. And I tell you, it's the same thing we've been talking about on the lawfare stuff as well. They're part of the lawfare. It doesn't happen without them. And we've got mechanisms in our Constitution to deal with that. We just haven't deployed them.
Okay, last two questions.
Thank you for your service in paying the price. Leaving as an example. My name is Aaron. I'm from Scalia Law. And just quickly, at least at the federal level, the Department of Justice, there are massive abuses of discretion and abusing prosecutorial authority. I'm not so convinced that doing tit for tat is going to de-escalate. It has to be done. The question I have is where America's about to elect your fired president. And we have a Supreme Court that has generally stood behind presidential removal power. Can't massive firings for abuse of discretion be one tool in both de-escalation, deterrence, and resolving this issue?
Yes, I mean, yeah, fire a lot of people at the Department of Justice. And here's one of the things I was thinking of. It's usually if the Department of Justice actually starts going after some of these liberal idols, we'll find out really quickly who's actually willing to do that and who's willing not to. It's a good way to lead out the chat. But I mean, I want to hit on that escalation point. You're worried, well, it might escalate. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, that is true. That's the logic of, you know, deterrence generally. You're worried about escalation matter too much. But that can't be a reason to do that because then you just get rolled over. And one other point on that, there's a win-win scenario that comes from doing your own lawfare, right? Pushing non-frivolous, colorable, but maybe long shot criminal cases. Well, then say you lose them. Okay, that's a tool that they can't use against us now, because now it went from a colorable argument to a frivolous argument after you lost it. So you got to think of all this lawfare is kind of like a one-shot use. I mean, Democrats have used it against us and put a lot of financial pain on our people. We should be willing to do that, push colorable arguments, because either we prevail or we lose, in which case they can't do that against us.
Last question.
Hi, Eric Rubenfeld. So I'm a practicing attorney. For any other practicing attorneys here who absorb the message, who do we call? Where do you sign up? Where do you volunteer? Where's the organization that you should give our names?
Well, I'll jump in here shamelessly. Where are you barred? We will lead you to help sue in that state. Riverside Project has 100 ongoing lawsuits. In several instances, we need help from attorneys who are barred in those regions. For example, in Delaware, where we were very involved in blowing up the Hunter Biden plea deal a year ago, we need people from Delaware. And so maybe we can have a conversation about where we could help use your bar license and legal talents. But there's something really incredible happening on the right now. America First Legal Judicial Watch, what Will Chamberlain's doing over at IAP, you're seeing a growth of kind of conservative legal organizations. And I believe what's really happening is a complete breakdown in congressional oversight. The public used to see that as our battlefield for fighting the administration. They've come to realize that that is all completely fake and goofy. and it's just letter sending with no consequence. And so as a result, I think a beneficial one is there's now more firepower, and the basics are in place. And I think those organizations, I'm sure I've visited a few, are well situated to take on especially seasoned litigators and people with diverse experiences to really wage these legal fights, because we have to scale up dramatically.
And I've got 6 amici that are going to file in my California bar thing that are looking for lawyers to represent them. So get my card and I'll give you that start in the process.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts on that question? No. Okay. Well, I'd like to read you 3 takeaway quotes out of many that I've written down. Number 1. Democrats don't change until they feel the pain of their own rules. Number 2, we are in a war. And number 3, get in the fight and stay in the fight. So thank you to this panel, and thank you all for your questions.
Oh, sorry, excuse me.